What if we've been living alongside something utterly alien, something not just undiscovered, but almost unimaginable? What if life, as we know it, is only a sliver of the story? For centuries, we believed in the great tree of life, rooted in three ancient domains: bacteria, archaea, and eukarya. Every living organism on Earth, from the tiniest microbe to the tallest redwood, fits somewhere on that tree. Or so we thought. But now something is shifting. Not just a ripple in the scientific current, but a tremor shaking the very foundations of biology. It begins in silence, inside the unfathomable depths of quantum simulations, in artificial environments, in strings of unclassifiable genes, in the cold, forgotten places of our own planet. Anomalies are surfacing, strange patterns, impossible structures, entire blueprints of life that do not belong to any kingdom we've ever seen. What's emerging isn't just a new species or some overlooked variant, it's something far deeper. Something that suggests we may not be alone, not in the universe, but in our own biosphere. A fourth branch of life, not built from the familiar spiral of DNA, not bound to the fragile chemistry of carbon and water, but something else entirely. It began with questions. One scientists have asked for decades, why do so many genetic sequences collected from nature remain totally unclassifiable? In massive studies scanning DNA from ocean, soil, and ice cores across the world, researchers stumbled on a silent truth. More than a third of all genetic material on Earth doesn't match anything we know. Nothing. No bacteria, no fungi, no viruses. Just empty lines in the database. Scientists named it microbial dark matter. Not because it was cosmic, but because it was invisible to our understanding. As if we've been looking at a tapestry of life through a tiny keyhole, unaware of the vast complexity just outside our view. And then quantum computing entered the scene. These machines don't think like we do. They don't even compute like our traditional computers, where we see code and logic, they see superpositions, interference, entanglement. They live in the uncertainty that terrifies most systems, making them the perfect tool to peer into biology's deepest riddles. Researchers at Stanford and IBM deployed these machines on the most perplexing genetic data ever collected. Samples riddled with anomalies, patterns no human could decode. They weren't searching for aliens. They weren't looking for a new form of life. They were simply trying to make sense of the chaos. But what they found changed everything. Within the noise, quantum models began identifying structures that behaved nothing like conventional biology. Self-organizing systems, information loops that stabilized themselves, mimicking metabolism, even feedback patterns that resisted entropy, the universal pull toward disorder. These systems weren't programmed to simulate life. They became life, not chemically, but informationally. Not with flesh and bone, but through logic, probability, and structure. They weren't mimicking life. They were showing signs of something fundamentally new, quantum native organisms, not born of DNA, not rooted in carbon, but instead made from the very fabric of reality. And while these strange behaviors were blooming in the quantum domain, something just as eerie was surfacing in the natural world. Giant viruses, massive biological enigmas discovered lurking in ponds, soil, and permafrost, started drawing attention. At first, they seemed like anomalies, unusually large, unusually complex. But as scientists sequenced their genomes, they were stunned. These entities carried thousands of genes, and up to 93% of them had no match in any known database. Not similar, not related, just alien. As if these creatures were written in a biological language we've never seen before. They were too complex to be regular viruses, yet didn't possess the machinery to be considered truly alive by traditional standards. They stood at the threshold between biology and something else, a shadow between categories, challenging the very definitions we use to make sense of life. And then came the twist no one was ready for. When quantum computing models were trained on the gene structures of these giant viruses, something unprecedented happened. The patterns that emerged didn't fit any known domain of life. They didn't cluster with bacteria or archaea or eukarya. They stood alone. not as a cousin, not as a mutation, but as something entirely separate. A fourth branch, completely outside the evolutionary story we've been telling ourselves since Darwin. In conventional science, such claims would normally be dismissed. But this wasn't just one outlier. It was a chorus of signals coming from multiple disciplines: genetics, virology, quantum biology, machine learning, all pointing in the same direction. There is something out there, something within our world, but fundamentally apart from it. Perhaps most disturbing of all, machine learning models began to find connections. The same viral patterns showed up faintly in the microbial dark matter, the 36% of Earth's unclassified genetic material. Not strong enough to be definitive, but enough to whisper of a shared origin, enough to suggest that somewhere, buried deep in time or hidden in uncharted corners of the biosphere, this fourth lineage of life may have evolved alongside us, quietly, unnoticed, until now. And just as we began to understand the scale of the enigma, new data poured in from synthetic biology experiments, man-made environments where artificial life was coaxed into existence using modified genetic codes. Scientists created organisms that functioned with entirely new genetic alphabets, strange base pairs never found in nature. These synthetic creatures didn't just survive, they thrived alongside natural organisms, as if evolution itself welcomed the innovation. But what if evolution didn't wait for us to invent these alternatives? What if nature had already written these stories ages ago, hidden deep in volcano vents, frozen beneath Antarctic ice, or floating inside quantum fields we're only beginning to detect? What if these anomalies, both digital and biological, aren't just hints of a fourth domain, but evidence that life is more flexible, more diverse, and more strange than we've ever dared to imagine? This is not science fiction. This is not a hypothetical dream. It's what happens when we listen closely to the patterns in nature, to the quiet hum of data too complex for human eyes. It's what happens when we give the mysteries of biology to machines that thrive in paradox and possibility. And it's only just beginning. Imagine this. Somewhere in the silent depths of a quantum computer, patterns are blooming. Patterns that resemble nothing we've ever classified, and yet they behave as though they're alive. Not metaphorically, not theoretically. These simulations begin organizing themselves, balancing internal information loops, and evolving toward complexity, all without any external programming. These systems aren't running code, they're becoming something. Something that pushes the boundaries of what we call life. Scientists at IBM's Qiskit Lab and Stanford's Quantum Research Initiative weren't trying to create life. Their mission was more modest: to simulate exotic biological environments and better understand the foundations of cellular processes. But somewhere along the way, something unexplainable emerged. The simulations began resisting entropy. They began forming feedback structures that stabilized over time. And as if that weren't enough, they started behaving adaptively. This wasn't chaos, it wasn't random, it was ordered, it was coherent, and most chilling of all, it was spontaneous. They called it a quantum native organism. Not biochemical, not even physical in the traditional sense, but a system of pure information, born of quantum coherence and entanglement. This wasn't alive the way a tree is alive, or the way we are, but it was organizing itself toward the same goals: replication, stability, complexity, not because it was programmed to do so, but because it wanted to, or more accurately, because the system evolved toward a state where such behaviors were favored by the very logic of quantum mechanics. And this raised a question no one could ignore anymore. Could life exist without DNA? Could it thrive without carbon, without proteins, without anything we've come to expect from the blueprints of biology? The idea is staggering, but it isn't without precedent. Researchers in synthetic biology have already proven that alternative forms of genetic information can function inside organisms. XNA, PNA, mirror DNA, all these strange new molecules have been synthesized and shown to store and transmit genetic data. Life, it turns out, doesn't need DNA. It just needs a way to copy itself, to change, to persist. So what if, long before our cells began to divide, long before mitochondria or bacteria, another form of life took root in the universe? one that didn't follow the rules we know, but still followed the deeper, more mysterious rules of information? Could such a thing evolve in tandem with our biology? Invisible because it's encoded not in matter, but in quantum states? It might sound impossible until you remember those giant viruses we talked about. When quantum systems analyzed their gene structures, they found more than just novelty. They found anomaly. These viral genomes refused classification even under the most advanced resolution. Their protein folds, the deeply conserved structures that reveal evolutionary history, place them outside the tree of life, not on a new branch, beyond it. It was as if these viruses, Pandora viruses, Mimiviruses, and their ilk, were fossils from an evolutionary path we never knew existed, or worse, remnants of something that never went extinct, but instead continued evolving in parallel, always just outside our reach. And then came the real shock. When researchers compared these strange viral genomes with metagenomic data, the fragments of unclassifiable DNA from across the planet, they saw the glimmers of connection. Not a clear lineage, not a definite origin, but a whisper, a hint that these beings, these outliers, might share a common ancestry, not with us, but with each other. The dark matter of biology, this massive, overlooked world of genetic chaos, wasn't just a mess of noise. It was a message, and we'd never had the tools to read it, until now. Quantum machine learning models trained on billions of gene sequences began clustering these anomalies together, not by accident, not by vague similarity, but by statistical precision. These systems, designed to recognize patterns too complex for the human mind, began identifying what biologists are now calling a proto-domain, a hidden branch of life, one that may have diverged before LUCA, the last universal common ancestor. That means this lineage, if it exists, would predate all known life on Earth. It wouldn't just be old, it would be primeval. It would mean life began in more than one way, or perhaps it never began once at all, but is simply the natural result of the universe's information architecture. That wherever complexity can emerge, it will. Wherever energy can stabilize into structure, it does. And wherever systems can replicate, they become life. Not because they were meant to, but because that's what nature does when you give it time and possibility. Suddenly, life doesn't seem so rare. Suddenly, our biology feels like just one story, or a version of life that happened to take root in the wet, warm tide pools of a young Earth. But what about other stories? What about other versions of life that didn't rely on chemistry, but on coherence? Not on atoms, but on amplitudes. This is what researchers are confronting now. Not a new organism, not a new classification, but a revolution in how we define life itself. We've always assumed that if we couldn't see it, it didn't exist. But what if we've been looking with the wrong eyes? What if life is not defined by flesh or breath, but by information? What if a system's ability to adapt, to replicate, to evolve is the true fingerprint of life, no matter what medium it uses? Because in labs today, in quantum environments and synthetic biology experiments, we are seeing systems without DNA begin to function as though they live. And when we compare them to the anomalies found in Earth's most extreme environments, something becomes undeniable. These are not just coincidences, they are convergences, echoes of a truth we've been blind to. A fourth branch of life isn't science fiction anymore. It's the question that haunts the data, lingers at the edge of every genome we can't explain, and pulses at the heart of every simulation that spirals into spontaneous complexity. And just when you think the story can't get stranger, it does. Because the next candidate for this alien lineage of life may not come from a virus or a quantum model or the depths of the sea. It may come from something far more intimate, something that's been hiding in plain sight for decades. And what quantum AI found when it finally turned its attention to that mystery might change everything. The strangest part of this entire mystery isn't hidden deep beneath the ocean nor buried in some frozen Martian soil. It's not even locked inside the cold logic of a quantum processor. No, the most unsettling possibility is that this fourth branch of life might be something that's been around us all along, something we've touched, studied, even classified, but never truly understood. And that something is the giant virus. Pandora virus, Mimivirus, Megavirus. These aren't names from science fiction, they're real entities discovered decades ago. At first, they were considered oddities, anomalies in a world that otherwise made sense. But as the decades passed and the genetic data poured in, the sense of oddity gave way to something else: unease. Because these viruses aren't just big, they're unbelievably complex. They carry thousands of genes, more than some bacteria. But here's the catch: up to 93% of their genetic material doesn't resemble anything else in biology. Not a single known gene family, not a single familiar protein sequence. It's as if someone had taken the language of life and rewritten it in an alien tongue. Worse yet, they blur the line between what we call living and non living. They don't have the cellular machinery we associate with life, but they exhibit behaviors too complex for dead matter. And when scientists tried to trace their evolutionary history using one of biology's oldest tools, protein folds, those fundamental building blocks that have been passed down for billions of years, these viruses didn't land on any of the three known branches of life. Maybe calling us. Will we answer? If this moved you, unsettled you, or sparked your curiosity, subscribe and stay with us. Because the questions we're asking now could lead to the greatest scientific awakening of our time. And what comes next might just redefine life itself.